Welcome back to the Englit Hit. Today we're going to explore the symbol of blood. What is it meant to represent? Is it a motif that changes in its figurative meaning across the play? What might Shakespeare have intended? These are some of the questions you should be asking yourself as we go through a few of the key moments in the play. Blood is one of the most prominent motifs in Macbeth. Eugene Huber says this of blood in the play. Shakespeare has indeed plotted a rather sanguinary path of disintegration for an initially respected and honourable individual, and it is through the extensive use of blood imagery that Macbeth's end is made the more horrific. Huber counted how many times the word blood, or one of its derivatives, is mentioned in the play, 48, with most of them clustered, 14 of them, clustered around Act 2, where of course Duncan is murdered and the consequences are explored. We're going to look at 10 references to blood in the play. They could all symbolise different things, so for the sake of encouraging debate, I've pre-modified them all using a different adjective. So we're going to look at brave blood, imagined blood, guilty blood, noble blood, paranoid blood, vengeful blood, tyrannical blood, national blood, hysterical blood, and brave blood, version 2. Who knew there were so many different types of blood? Firstly then, brave blood. The picture of Macbeth at the beginning of the play is of an honourable warrior, commended for his valiant acts on the battlefield. In fact, he has shown such prowess at the war that the captain makes these comments in Act 1, Scene 2. For brave Macbeth, well, he deserves that name, disdaining fortune with his brandished steel, which smoked with bloody execution, like Valor's minion, carved out his passage till he faced the slave. And, except they meant to bathe in reeking wounds or memorise another Golgotha, I cannot tell. Here is a man who relishes the opportunity to confront enemies and secure victory for his king. Importantly, blood at this stage is a product of Macbeth's bravery. Look at the way in which he meant to bathe in blood. He is comfortable here on the battlefield. This is his domain. Shakespeare evokes the image of Christ's crucifixion, Golgotha, or place of the skull, the hill on which thousands of criminals were executed by the Roman Empire. We need to ask ourselves why Shakespeare creates this impression of Macbeth at the beginning of the play. Certainly, it is a positive image, but is it also a little foreboding? He's capable of these atrocious acts. Yes, they are committed in war, he's on solid ground morally speaking, but does he enjoy it a bit too much? Is he too at ease with extreme violence? Well, very quickly Shakespeare uses the motif of blood for a different purpose. By Act 2, Scene 1, Macbeth has imagined blood that symbolises his ambitious desire to secure the throne, his intention to use violence for immoral ends. In his soliloquy before the murder of Duncan, Macbeth says this, "And on thy blade and dudgeon gouts of blood, which was not so before. There's no such thing. It is the bloody business which informs thus to mine eyes." Here the blade, this imagined dagger, is leading Macbeth to commit this act of regicide. A question of agency arises yet again. Is Macbeth led by his own desires, his hamartia, that fatal flaw, the ambition that drives he and his wife to plot against Duncan, or is he coerced and controlled by external supernatural forces that have invoked this image from on high? Is this vision of a dagger the creation of the witches? Alternatively, does the blood on the dagger represent his inherent sense of morality, a pre-existing guilt even before he kills the king? In other instances of imagined blood, the reason seems to be that the imaginer is consumed by guilt. This leads nicely on to guilty blood. How blood is used to convey a sense of unbearable regret, but also it is used more literally to frame the servants for the murder of Duncan, literal guilt. Lady Macbeth says, "If he do bleed, I'll gild the faces of the grooms withal, for it must seem their guilt." So blood is a sign of guilt. You hack someone to death, there's going to be a fair bit of blood. But it is extended to the mind in the Macbeth's case. And Shakespeare uses a literal indication of guilt to represent a deep-rooted regret. Following the murder of Duncan, Macbeth proclaims, "Will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand? No, This my hand will rather the multitudinous seas incarnadine, making the green one red. He is convinced that all the water in the world could not cleanse him of his guilt. Instead, the blood on his hands will make all the water in the world red. It's worth pausing to look at the contrast between Macbeth's attitude to their act of regicide and Lady Macbeth's. She says, "A little water clears us of this deed." Unfortunately for her, she realises at the beginning of Act 5 that this is not the case. The way Macbeth responds to the murder of Duncan in the company of friends is interesting because it reveals something of the attitude towards kingly blood a Jacobean audience might have had. They would have viewed it as noble blood. In Act 2, Scene 3, Macbeth says, "Here lay Duncan, his silver skin laced with his golden blood, and his gashed stabs looked like a breach in nature for ruin's wasteful entrance. There, the murderers, steeped in the colours of their trade, their daggers unmannily breached with gore. Who could refrain that had a heart to love, and in that heart courage to make love known?" Macbeth is, of course, speaking insincerely. He wants to look like the innocent flower. The speech is a little misjudged, though. It comes across as prepared, which wouldn't really be what you're going for when you just discovered the king murdered for the first time. But his use of the adjectives silver and golden, while they also express the lack of spontaneity, convey how much value was attributed to the king. These are precious metals. He has his place in the natural order of things, the king. He is appointed divinely by God. And should somebody disrupt that social hierarchy, there's a problem. Macbeth calls the gashed stabs a breach in nature. Yes, it is ironic that he accuses the murderers, him in reality, of being steeped in the colours of their trade, also him in reality, which he was only a scene ago lamenting that all the water in the world could not wipe the blood clean from his hands. But this tells us how a Jacobean audience would have been utterly disgusted by the prospect of regicide, by the prospect of an uprising, wresting the throne from the king by force. Next, let's have a look at how Macbeth becomes increasingly paranoid and how this relates to Shakespeare's use of blood, paranoid blood. In Act 3, Scene 4, Macbeth has ordered the killing of Banquo because, in the back of his mind, the witch's prophecy that thou shalt have kings worries him. Here is an exchange after the deed of dreadful note has been enacted. "There's blood on thy face. 'Tis Banquo's then. 'Tis better thee without than he within. Is he dispatched?" Why does Shakespeare include this, we might ask? Well, this really exposes a transformation in Macbeth's character. He doesn't seem as tied down in his guilt, not like he was immediately after killing Duncan. Now it appears that Macbeth is securing his throne. He even says that it is better the blood being on the murderer's face than within Banquo's veins. This is a man no longer concerned with the implications of murder. Rather, he is fixated on his plan to solidify his grip on power. He is completely paranoid, and the bloodshed is representative of that paranoia. Next, Macbeth describes blood in terms of revenge, vengeful blood. He sees it as inevitable that when an immoral act is committed, revenge will be sought. He says in Act 3, Scene 4, "It will have blood," they say. "Blood will have blood." It is like the natural implication of murder is more murder. This marks Macbeth's rapid descent into brutal massacre. He has killed Duncan, Duncan's servants, Banquo, and more will be murdered yet. But it also shows that he fears revenge. He has just confronted Banquo's ghost, an embodiment of his worst fears. "Thou canst not say I did it! Never shake thy gory locks at me!" It would be interesting to create some kind of flowchart to track Macbeth's relationship with blood. Not long ago in the play, he was celebrating Banquo's blood on the face of the murderer. Now he is aghast at the sight of his own creation, dead Banquo. Then he seeks the witches out to confront them about this, to garner more information about his future. When he arrives, they tell him three things. First, that he should beware Macduff. Second, that none of woman born shall harm Macbeth. And finally, that Macbeth shall never vanquished be until great Birnam Wood to high Dunsinane Hill shall come against him. But they fill him with false confidence. They're purposefully tricking him, because Macduff is not born of woman, in the sense that he was delivered by caesarean section, and the forest will move, because the army will wear the branches of the trees. The witches are distorters of fact, spinning tales in order to disrupt things. They stir up his arrogance by saying, "Be bloody, bold and resolute." They map out his path for him by presenting Banquo, blood-boltered Banquo, to mock Macbeth as a ghost, to spur him on to commit more murder. Is this bloody vision meant to inspire him on to avoid similar threats in the future, to deal with Macduff and everything he represents? And Macbeth is a tyrant, isn't he? Just like Lennox and the Lord say in Act 3, Scene 6. After seeing the ghost of his murdered friend, he concludes in Act 3, Scene 4 that we are yet but young indeed. That euphemism that keeps cropping up in the play, deed, that word that Macbeths share for murder, is used yet again to show that Macbeth is not even nearly done. Blood will mark his tenure as king like no king before him. The blood we see in the murder of Macduff's wife and son is tyrannical blood. "He has killed me, mother," the poor boy cries. Important comma there. You don't want to go saying, "He has killed me, mother." So, let's widen the scope a little bit here. Let's zoom out. Yes, these are individual acts, heinous acts of murder, but this is all part of a larger mission on Macbeth's part. He is seeking security and stability for his regime, and in order to achieve that, he needs to alleviate every threat. But how do the outsiders view all of this? What do Malcolm, Donalbain and Macduff, those who have fled to England, think as they look on from a distance? Well, Shakespeare uses the metaphor of blood to describe Scotland. He personifies Scotland. And Scotland, of course, is torn asunder by Macbeth's exploits. And this is what I've called national blood. Macduff says in Act 4, Scene 3, "Bleed, bleed, poor country." Remember, while Macbeth's actions are very exciting and obviously make for a great play, Shakespeare has to ultimately condemn all of this treason and bloodshed. He can't start inciting a riot or condoning violence. He has to stand up for the peaceful transfer of power. Otherwise, he'd have people storming Parliament, like in the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, or the Capitol Riots of 2021. Now, this next type of blood I've called hysterical blood. We're going to look at Lady Macbeth's scene in Act 5, Scene 1, in which she unravels into mental hysteria. This too demonstrates her guilty feelings, but it's more than that. Unlike Macbeth in the first part of the play, she completely deteriorates. He at least maintains some control over the situation, but she is utterly destroyed, perhaps because her husband rejects her entirely. Here's what she says: "Out, damned spot! Out, I say! Here's the smell of the blood still. All the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand. Oh, oh, oh!" She is consumed with a vision of blood that is not there. Look at the repetition and the exclamations. She is completely obsessed, and she has, I think, descended into madness. It's interesting that Shakespeare uses similar language here to when Macbeth was dealing with the murder of Duncan. She laments that all the best perfume could not dispel the smell of blood from her hand. It's reminiscent, of course, of Macbeth's line when he says, "All great Neptune's ocean." Finally, we come full circle, and Shakespeare returns us to the association of blood with bravery. Macbeth is surrounded on all sides. The fight is all but over. And yet he presses on, determined not to yield to the forces that threaten his power. This is the same Macbeth as the beginning, isn't it? Just look at how he addresses a servant in Act 5, Scene 3. "Go, prick thy face and overread thy fear, thou lily-livered boy." He calls him a coward. It reminds me of that moment when Lady Macbeth says, "My hands are of your colour, but I do shame to wear a heart so white." With that contrast of the bloody red and the lily white. He is encouraging his comrades to be brave. Perhaps here we see Macbeth in his comfort zone. This is what he was made for after all, battle and war. Maybe that's part of the reason why he could not cope with the power of kingship once he had secured the throne. Well, confident that he is unassailable, with the witch's prophecies tucked in his pocket, he exclaims to Macduff, "Thou losest labour, as easy mayst thou the entrenchant air, with thy keen sword impress as make me bleed." He is sure that Macduff can do him no harm. He is just stabbing the air. He thinks, Macbeth thinks, his blood is safe. But like lots of things in the play, Macbeth has severely misjudged the situation. And the blood that is shed in these final scenes is the same brave blood that Macbeth bathes in during the opening of the play. This is honourable, honest vindication for the right king, Malcolm. It is the restoration of the monarchy, the retribution of the dead butcher, as Malcolm calls Macbeth. One could say that in the end, Macbeth ended in the same way as the former Thane of Cawdor. Nothing in his life became him like the leaving it. So what does blood mean? What does it symbolise, represent in Macbeth? Lots of things is the answer. You need to unravel the different meanings in order to examine each particular scene.